And so this idea of structural fixes is really, really important. If we're going to create the great turning, change human society, we've got to create structures that actually make behaviors easy. For example, the recycling bin over there is a structure that allows us to easily recycle, based on a mental model that perhaps one of the truths about Mother Nature is that everything cycles in Mother Nature, and that perhaps by modeling our own behavior after Mother Nature, we might actually move towards sustainability. But it's a structure that makes recycling easy. When I first started recycling with my kids in 1981, 1982, we had to take our recycling stuff down to the town collection area. Nobody was coming to our house and picking it up. We did it because it was a lesson for our kids. We took the effort to do it, but there was a structure. The structures that make it easy weren't there. Changing structures is important to changing behavior. And so that a permaculture garden out there is a structure that allows us to explore ideas about how farming and gardening and how our relationship with Mother Nature might be. Without that structure, it's just a really good idea. The structures allow us to explore different ways of being. And so discovering structure is really important. Your homework is to pull out a news story. Some of you have done it already, and I'll give you some feedback. Thank you for that. Pull out a news story, just anything in the news, and to identify what structures are resulting in this behavior over and over again. Let's see. So we're going deeper in the iceberg. I want to show you a very brief clip, which is a review of how we use the iceberg and why we use the iceberg, suggesting that events are not accidents, but results, sometimes unintentional, but necessarily results of particular kinds of structures. Let's see if I can get this one working.
Human systems and the causes of their behavior. In this video, we'll look at the source of the problems in a human system, how you change the system behavior, and the question of who is responsible for the system behavior. Let's consider a problem of a large-scale human system. One of the principles of systems thinking is that what we call problems are actually a result of the system functioning perfectly as designed. In the United States, there's an epidemic of early onset of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a disease normally acquired in middle age and is caused by overconsumption of sugar. In the United States, children are now developing this serious disease. We would clearly consider this a problem. In the systems thinking language, the disease epidemic is a symptom of the system. At the left, we correlate this symptom with the tip of an iceberg to emphasize the fact that, like an iceberg, what is seen is only about 10% of the larger problem. And, like an iceberg, if we spent our energy on somehow eliminating the tip, the buoyancy forces acting on the volume of ice beneath the surface would recreate the tip. In the same way, if we could somehow cure the disease, we expect that children would continue to acquire the disease because of systemic forces. What are these forces? Beneath the surface, there are hidden patterns of behavior or trends that lead to the symptom. In the illustration of diabetes, there is an overabundance of sugar in the diet of children in the United States. Why are children eating so much sugar? Well, beneath the pattern of this consumption, there's a set of systemic structures that cause the pattern. Again, in our illustration, high consumption of sugar for children is a consequence of farming policies from the 1970s that results in billions of dollars of federal monies used to subsidize the growth of corn each year. This overproduction of corn has been converted to high fructose corn syrup, which is a concentrated sugar. In other words, sugar is a subsidized commodity. It is therefore used as an ingredient in many food products whose costs are now lower because of the subsidy. The bottom line is that foods containing sugar and sugar products are very low cost and have therefore become a larger fraction of our caloric intake. Now, how did these systemic structures get in place? Well, those who created the policies had a set of mental models that farm subsidies would be beneficial. They assumed that without government subsidies, farmers would no longer farm and the U.S. would not have a reliable source of food. So back to our systems principle, we can see that the problem of early onset of type 2 diabetes is actually the result of the system functioning perfectly as designed, beginning with the beliefs and assumptions of the designers. To be sure, it is an unintended consequence, but it is a direct consequence of the hidden mental models, the systemic structures that are created out of those mental models, and the patterns that arise because of the structure. To permanently fix the problem, we must intervene in the hidden parts of the system, with the higher leverage lying in the deepest part of the system, the mental models.
So our work in sustainable agriculture is to try to change systemic structures by creating things like permaculture gardens and earth foods and simple gifts and the Real Food Challenge, these kind of structures that actually begin to shift behavior. In the example of type 2 diabetes, there may be other structures that contribute to it. I'm sure there are. There are other kinds of behavior that develop the need and desire for cheap sugar. But that's one of them. That the American farm policy actually contributes to a system in which the pattern of behavior of overconsumption of cheap sugar products becomes the norm. In order to shift behavior, we've got to look at the structures and look at the mental models that contribute to those behaviors. And so that's what we're going to do over the next week or so, is how do we begin to understand what structures are contributing to behaviors and what mental models cause the structures to be part of the norm. Recycling is an example. Recycling is a pattern of behavior on this campus. We have won awards because our campus recycles at a higher percentage than most campuses in the country. We also produce more waste than a lot of the campuses in the country. And so part of the problem with our recycling program is it allows us to have the mental model that, we can create all sorts of plastic products because no problem we can recycle them. We have indeed increased our recycling rate. We've also increased the level of garbage, or excess product that's necessary. In order to get at the root causes of excess product, we need to look beyond the simple tool, which is working in some ways. These fixes, they actually work, which is why they become part of the norm. But they don't actually solve the problem at a deep, deep level. Anyway, recycling is a pattern of behavior. Most everybody throws stuff in the right bin on their way out the door. You have to have structures to do this. You've got to have recycling bins, the composting bins with the DCs and all that. They've all got to be there. Some of the systemic structures are physical things. And so in my homework, I asked you to try to identify physical things. I asked you to identify organizations, policies, and rituals that might contribute to a particular news story. Organizations, we've got to have UMass, the Waste Management Group, to make this happen. It's a structure. It's an organization that's part of UMass that makes recycling a common behavior. We're going to have policies. For example, if you pull up the web page, you see on the page, the front page of the Waste Management Group, you can see the policies around the kinds of things that can be recycled and where they can be recycled and why they can be recycled. We have policies that affect behavior. And of course, the ritual is simply ritual is a habit that we do but without thinking, becomes part of our lives. And so the ritual, the habit of recycling becomes the norm at a place like UMass. Not everywhere. The dorms are particularly bad at recycling. I don't know what it is about the culture of the dormitory. Perhaps that you don't want to get caught with all the beer cans because you're not of age. But there are other things that intervene there. But their dorms generally don't do as well as the classrooms and the DCs and other places. The blue wall for recycling. But it has become a ritual. So my homework is to ask you to look for these things, these physical things, these organizations, these policies, and perhaps even rituals where they're simply habits that we don't think about any longer. And some of you had some really interesting rituals proposed in the homework that was due this week. Thank you for that. What I want to look at is the question of the Great Turning. The Great Turning feels to me like a really big idea that if you can't see evidence of the Great Turning, it's crazy. And if something is crazy, I'm not going to ever convince you that it's a possibility. It's just too far outside of my existence, of my daily activities, to believe it's possible. And so as I'm reframing my world with somebody who's a non-believer, I need to be able to provide examples of structures and behaviors that are realistic and real possible, that within my world view that is a possibility. So I asked the question about the Great Turning. Remember the Great Turning? Is it holding actions? Are part of it, this is the stop certain behaviors and pointing out when things are not working. Structural changes, that's structural changes like putting recycling bins in classrooms or shifts in policy. And of course the change in consciousness. There's a shift in mental models that makes all this happen. All of these are necessary for the great turning, that is the move from the industrial growth society or industrial growth mentality, which we all carry. In 2008, when the economy went south, nobody was talking about should we be spending less. We were all talking about let's buy our way out of this great recession. And what we did was we borrowed a lot of money from China. We took we leveraged our future. We basically put our children in debt for the long term in order to buy ourselves out of a recession. Not asking the question at all is, should we be in this inflationary growth mode as a way of being? Nobody really asked that question. And so the great turning suggests maybe there's a different way of being. I have to ask then, is there any evidence that the great turning is real? And so as I'm reframing for you, I may talk to you about the shift from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society, and everybody kind of goes, yawn, that sounds really good. But if it's not real, if it's not something I can do anything about, it's quickly forgotten as I go on with my day and participate in an industrial growth world. Right here, there are structural changes that I'd like to share with you. Another video clip, my last one for the day, that suggests there indeed are examples, like UMass permaculture, of people who are trying to shift our consciousness, change our behavior, and create new structures that are consistent with the great turning.